Hello everyone and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Operation Wolf, an arcade light gun shooter developed and published by Taito and released to arcades in 1987 with a significant number of console and computer ports following in later years. We are going to talk about that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 92. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges. We have prizes. We have great discussions. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, and Wendell Jr. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star count or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. By all means, you should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really good experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. Give it a go. But I cannot recommend these games to the broad gaming population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Operation Wolf. Operation Wolf is an arcade light gun shooter developed and published by Taito and released to arcades back in 1987 with a ton of home ports following in later years. Before we can talk about Operation Wolf, we've got to take a step back and talk about the history of light guns in general, a technology that has fallen a bit out of favor nowadays, but was at one point an incredibly popular gaming genre in both arcades and on home consoles, with titles like Duck Hunt, Hogan's Alley, T2 Judgment Day, Virtua Cop, Time Crisis, and American Laser Games' entire gamography being a testament to the technology's pervasiveness in the 80s throughout the 90s. The concept of light guns did not originate in arcades, though, because the technology, or at least the foundations for the technology, actually began its existence as early as 1912, which is when an early interactive film, sort of, was released in the UK entitled Life Targets. Life Targets was essentially a movie that, while billed as an interactive film, wasn't really all that interactive at all, as the entire film was a purely linear experience that, at different times, would display a target on the screen, once again without any variation from one quote-unquote playthrough to the next. That film was synced with a gun-like apparatus, which understood the timing of when certain images would appear in the film, and if a viewer pulled the trigger at the right time, then the movie would pause for a brief moment, points would be added to the player's score, and the film would continue to play. It didn't matter where you pointed your gun device, the film didn't change whether you timed your shot accurately or not, and there was little, if any, replayability to the whole thing. But regardless, Life Targets represents the first known instance of using a gun-like device in conjunction with a form of interactive media. This wasn't a light gun per se, as that technology has a very specific definition and specification which we'll be talking about in a little bit, but it was a pseudo-interactive shooting gallery, and as such was effectively the prototype for nearly every mechanical and digital shooting style experience that would follow. While Life Targets might not have been a real light gun experience, the first true example of a light gun-based product would be a device called the Seeburg Ray-O-Lite, released in 1936, which was made by prominent jukebox manufacturer Seeburg as a way to add some interactivity and fun to wooden cabinets that had previously only been used as musical devices in bars, upper-class homes, and large public venues. The Ray-O-Lite presented players with an experience most akin to the NES title Duck Hunt, in that your goal was to shoot a mechanical duck that would randomly fly, so to speak, across a predetermined track built into the cabinet. Players would have access to a shotgun-like device that was outfitted with a diode that would emit a beam of light anytime the trigger was pulled, while the cabinet's mechanical duck was manufactured with a light-sensing vacuum tube embedded within it that was designed to detect that light beam and register a hit and give players a point if the light beam was seen by the vacuum tube. This technology, where sensors on an object would detect light beams fired at them, would form the foundation of nearly every mechanical shooting gallery kind of experience found in carnivals, fairgrounds, and other amusement parks for the next 30 years or so, and even beyond. If you've ever played a shooting gallery kind of mechanical game, like those that used to be found at Adventureland in Walt Disney World or other similar amusement parks, you have seen this kind of technology at work, and I recall having tons of fun as a kid shooting at pseudo-targets with a fake gun, and seeing cans, bottles, dishes, and other items fall down, only to magically pop back up seconds later as the apparatus reset itself. This technology continued to evolve following its first introduction in the Ray-O-Lite, and would eventually move away from a purely mechanical kind of configuration into more of an integration between mechanical devices and pre-recorded film strips, which is what formed the basis of Sega's Duck Hunt, the first game that combined the light-sensing mechanics of prior devices with a rear projection screen playing a film strip on constant repeat. Whereas players shot at different targets, objects would disappear from the screen, similar to mechanical shooting galleries of the past. Now, if you're like me, a couple of potential observations probably caught you by surprise. For one, the fact that Sega had released a light gun game called Duck Hunt in 1969, many years before the digital Nintendo release of the same name, was a bit of a shock. And while there's no direct lineage between Nintendo's Duck Hunt and Sega's version of the title, I still found the coincidence interesting. And secondly, the fact that the core light gun technology had not appreciably changed for over 30 years struck me as an interesting lapse in technological progress. That's not to say that the technology was stagnant, but the degree of change and evolution was not nearly as rapid as what I personally would have expected. Interestingly, the whole concept of what a light gun game could be and how the technology could be improved upon would really start shifting in the 1970s with the advent of digital video and arcade games, which, as we've discussed in prior episodes of the podcast, heralded a transformation across the entire industry from focusing purely on electromechanical devices like pinball and standalone interactive games like Sega's submarine combat title Periscope, to more digital representations of interactive experiences using video screens and joysticks, buttons, and embedded electronics and circuitry. The shift to digital video games affected literally every pre-existing genre in the arcade gaming space, while also providing opportunities for intrepid developers to create brand new genres of titles that previously could not even have been imagined. For the purposes of our discussion, though, we're going to focus solely on the evolution of the light gun shooter, which, like we talked about, had previously utilized technology that involved gun-like devices emitting a beam of light that would be detected by some sort of sensor or receiver in a mechanical device, causing something to happen. Well, with the shift to digital technology, embedding physical sensors in arcade cabinets just didn't make much sense, because ultimately, developers needed to figure out how to integrate light gun-driven player actions with arcade monitors, not real-world sensors and objects. At the same time, there was still a desire to evolve the state of light gun technology. The only question was how to actually make that happen. The solution to that engineering question would come from looking at a similar, albeit decidedly different technology: computer light pens. We've mentioned this previously, but to provide a refresher, in the very early days of the computer industry, the number of ways that individuals could actually interact with computers was fairly limited. Nowadays, pointing and clicking with a mouse is pretty much synonymous with the act of using a computer, and beyond that, numerous other human interface devices exist today for individuals to interact with and control computer systems. But in the 1960s and 70s, using a computer typically meant one of two things. You were either typing commands into a keyboard, or you were loading commands into a computer via paper punch cards. In fact, the concept of a mouse hadn't even progressed beyond prototypes and industry demonstrations at this point in history. That being said, there were some very specific use cases in different industries, primarily in the defense sector and various military organizations, that had access to some alternate cutting-edge technologies that typical computer users may not have even realized existed. One of those technologies was, as you may have guessed, the light pen. Light pens were an interesting device in the world of computing, as they provided an alternative, direct means of accessing certain capabilities of specialized graphics-based computer systems, like what you might see in radar systems and army surveillance systems. With light pens, users could select and manipulate objects on a computer screen, simply by placing the tip of the device on the screen and moving it. Conceptually, this is very similar to how touchscreen devices work in modern times, albeit without the just use your finger approach that we all enjoy today. From a technological perspective, though, there was some pretty interesting behind-the-scenes stuff going on to allow light pens to actually interact with computer screens. Light pens were designed with a light sensor embedded in the device's tip, which, when passed over a cathode ray tube or CRT monitor, would detect light from the screen and transmit the general brightness of that light to the connected computer system. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how does knowing how bright a certain part of the screen is allow you to actually interact with a computer? Well, the answer to that question lies in how CRT displays work. CRTs use an electron gun to actively paint, so to speak, every single pixel on a screen, multiple times each second. The electron gun typically has a certain vertical and horizontal frequency, which dictates how quickly that gun activates pixels in both directions. Well, because CRTs were pervasive across the industry around this time, the capabilities of the technology were very well understood by electrical and computer engineers, and by observing the horizontal and vertical frequencies of the monitor, and comparing the brightness of the pixels being detected by the light pen, the computer could infer where on the screen the user was pointing the device by calculating which pixels were actively being activated by the CRT's electron gun. You might think that this kind of inference and calculation routine would result in less than accurate results, but in fact, this technology was oftentimes more accurate than early touchscreen devices that would begin making their way to market years later. I admittedly don't know how early engineers came up with a way to make this work, but I found it fascinating that such an early technology worked so well, especially given the general constraints of computers around this time. And by the way, if that description of how light pens and CRTs worked sounded confusing, it's because it kinda is. The key concept to take away is that computers were able to calculate where the light pen is pointing using the unique characteristics of CRT display technology, the brightness of the pixels detected by the light pen, and the timing associated with how CRTs paint pixels on the screen. Anyway, the core technology found in light pens would end up making their way to the digital light gun-based arcade machines of the 1970s, where rather than shooting beams of light at physical sensors, light-detecting sensors would be embedded inside the barrel of gun-like devices, which would be activated whenever a player pulled the gun's trigger. These sensors would then detect light that would emanate from the game's video monitor, and depending on the logic used by that particular game and the well-known frequency timing of CRT arcade monitors, the game would either register a hit or a miss, and update the player's score accordingly. This shift in how light guns worked would end up paving the way for nearly every light gun experience that would follow for the next 20 or so years, and it didn't take long before various games using the new light gun technology would begin showing up in arcades around the world. The interesting thing here, though, is that these early digital light gun experiences ended up being less popular than their mechanical counterparts that had been prevalent for the prior 40 years. Arcade manufacturers like Sega, Atari, and Taito tried their best to drive interest in the new technology, but ultimately, arcade goers just were not all that into this new digital light gun fad. At least, not yet. That would all change in 1984, when Nintendo introduced two new games into their Nintendo VS line of arcade Famicom-based systems, those being the light gun shooters Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley. Duck Hunt, which like I previously mentioned, has no relation to the Sega Duck Hunt title we talked about earlier, is perhaps one of the most well-known light gun titles of all time, as it would achieve universal popularity following its release on the NES home console in 1985, coupled with the release of the Nintendo Zapper light gun peripheral. That game tasks players with testing their aim by shooting a number of ducks that fly across the screen, each of which have unique random patterns and faster flight speeds as the game progresses. Hogan's Alley, by contrast, is more of a shooting gallery kind of experience, where players are presented with a series of cardboard cutouts representing criminals, civilians, and police, with the player needing to select which targets to shoot and which ones to avoid, all the while trying to aim at and shoot the right targets as quickly as possible. With the release of Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley, interest in light gun games exploded effectively overnight, as gamers flocked to the arcades to try their hand at setting high scores at both titles. And with that renewed focus, game developers everywhere began creating their own light gun titles, seeking to cash in on gamers' newfound interest in the genre in the hopes of bringing worthwhile and profitable games to the market. The thing is, though, most of these new light gun titles were focused on delivering the same kinds of shooting gallery and hunting experiences that had been prevalent since the earliest days of light gun technology, with very little progression in terms of game styles beyond those early interactive shooting experiences. Sure, light gun technology itself had evolved over the decades, with the current implementation being a modified version of the light pen technology we discussed a few minutes ago. But the actual content of the games that light guns could now be used on? That hadn't changed for years. One company, however, had been experimenting in alternative shooting experiences since the 1970s, and that was the prolific arcade video game developer and publisher, Taito. Shortly after the first digital light gun titles began making their way to arcades in the mid-70s, Taito tried their hand at creating their own light gun arcade shooter, that being the 1976 title Attack. Attack, unlike the majority of light gun titles, did not present players with a passive shooting gallery kind of experience, or a serene nature scenario with digital animals just waiting to be hunted. Instead, Attack delivered a much more visceral, action-oriented experience, where players were tasked with shooting a number of bad guys riding around in tanks, jeeps, and trucks, with the intent of killing those enemies in pursuit of a wartime victory. To make the experience feel that much more impactful, Taito designed the arcade cabinet with two mounted light guns modeled as big bad machine guns, giving players the feeling that they themselves were traveling along in an armored vehicle, with only their own reflexes and aim standing between victory and death. While Attack didn't really perform any better in the market than its shooting gallery-styled contemporaries, it definitely represented a different approach to light gun gaming. And when the genre began to become more popular in the mid-80s, Taito considered that this might be the time to give the concept of a light gun military-based shooter another go. With that general vision in mind, Taito began developing the title that would eventually come to be known as Operation Wolf. With Operation Wolf, Taito was looking to leverage a few unique cultural and video game trends that had become popular in recent years. For one, like we said, the light gun shooter genre itself was experiencing a renewed interest across the entire gaming industry. Secondly, this was in the mid-80s we're talking about, and as anyone who lived through the 80s knows, or anyone with an affinity for the 80s can tell you, one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the 1980s was the awesome, over-the-top, war-themed action movie, where movie stars like Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger blew up and shot countless evildoers, dropping one-liners and cliched quips along the way like they were going out of style. And thirdly, there had been an explosion in third-person side-scrolling shooting titles like Russian Attack and Contra that utilized similar wartime themes to deliver over-the-top action experiences with swarms of unlimited enemies attacking players from all sides. The Taito development team considered that if they could combine those three trends into a single balls-to-the-wall experience, they might in fact have a hit on their hands. So, the team began creating Operation Wolf, settling on a storyline featuring a wartime scenario where you play as Special Forces operative Roy Adams, a highly trained soldier who is tasked with completing a number of missions in the hopes of saving hostages that had been taken by an enemy militaristic force. Rather than present players with a third-person perspective action experience, the team would create Operation Wolf to be a first-person affair, giving players a personalized and more in-your-face view of the battlefield, which would be populated by highly realistic, at least for the time, human combatants, vehicles, and weaponry, which is the first time such a realistic and violent shooting experience would make its way to a video game. And to make the experience even more visceral, Operation Wolf was designed in a way similar to Taito's prior title Attack, with two mounted machine light guns that players could use to aim and shoot every single enemy that stood in the way of victory. Those guns, by the way, would feature a built-in recoil mechanic, meaning that players could actually feel the impact of every one of their shots every time they pulled the trigger. Over a period of several months, the team would exclusively work on the title, refining the gunplay, enemies, and difficulty until finally Operation Wolf would be ready to release to arcades around the world in mid to late 1987. And upon its release, it wouldn't take long before gamers and critics alike began heaping praise on the title, with many people declaring the game's graphics, gameplay, and controls to be among the best they had ever experienced in a modern arcade title, with the only critiques for the game centering on the fact that Operation Wolf was, unlike many of its contemporaries, a decidedly violent game, which was absolutely not the norm for video games in the late 80s. Particular controversy focused on the control scheme for the game, which, like I mentioned, used a couple of very realistic mounted machine guns to provide players with a means for shooting numerous bad guys and enemy vehicles across the game's multi-mission campaign. Sure, violent games had existed before, but most of those titles had an obfuscated control scheme, where players needed to use joysticks and buttons to accomplish their missions. Operation Wolf removed that artificial control barrier, instead placing pseudo-guns in players' hands and encouraging them to wreak as much havoc on their enemies' forces as possible. It's not hard to see why certain groups would have a bit of an issue with such a direct analog for real-world violence, albeit in arcade form. Despite that controversy, or perhaps partly because of it, Operation Wolf would go on to become insanely successful, with the game maintaining a top spot on numerous arcade game sales charts for over a year following its release, literally in every major geographic territory in the world, while also winning various Action Title of the Year awards from multiple publications. This success would push the team to port the title to various home video game systems, including the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Master System, and interestingly, numerous computer systems as well, including the MS-DOS, Amiga 500, Atari ST, and Commodore 64 computer platforms, just to name a few. Even more interesting is the fact that outside of the NES and the Sega Master System, none of those other platforms had a light gun peripheral to be used with the game, with players needing to either use a game control pad or a computer keyboard in order to aim and fire upon the various enemy hordes that populated the title. I'll talk more about my opinion on the various control schemes available for Operation Wolf in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, using a control pad or keyboard, or pretty much anything other than a light gun or a mouse for a light gun based game, is almost certainly not the best experience. Anyway, Operation Wolf would go on to spawn a successful game franchise, with 4 sequels released over the last 36 years, and the latest title in the series, Operation Wolf Returns First Mission, releasing just last year in 2023. Beyond those direct sequels though, Operation Wolf should perhaps be most widely recognized for its influence on arcade titles and future light gun shooters, as after Operation Wolf, nearly every light gun title released focused on driving more realistic violence and over-the-top action into the experience, with games like Lethal Enforcers and T2 Judgment Day becoming incredibly popular titles in their own right. The days of the shooting gallery game were pretty much over, to be replaced by war, violence, and action. It was Operation Wolf, more than any other title, that drove that shift in the marketplace, and to say that gamers enjoyed this new style of gameplay would be an understatement. And in fact, while such titles are not typically referenced in the same breath as edgy, controversial games with excessive violence and mature themes like the Mortal Kombat series, Doom, or heaven forbid, Night Trap, I would argue that light gun shooters are in fact more mature experiences than many of those titles, simply because many of them presented realistic situations using semi-realistic weaponry, blurring the lines between typical game control schemes and the act of actually experiencing the feeling of shooting a gun. Now, I'm not suggesting that such titles could possibly induce violent tendencies in normal, sane individuals, as I am very strongly against any such assertion that violent video games beget violence in real life. What I am saying, though, is that light gun games likely fulfilled a similar niche as other violent and more mature themed games. They just flew under the radar a bit when compared to some of the even more popular gaming genres of the early 90s. Beyond Operation Wolf and its own legacy, I'd be remiss if I didn't continue our story on light gun technology in general. As many of you are likely aware that the traditional light gun, with its light sensing diodes and CRT display requirements, are effectively no longer a thing in modern video games. The decline in the technology and the complete shift away from what we've described as light gun gaming up to this point was driven primarily by the introduction of LCD monitors and televisions, which all had different frequencies, timing, and methods for drawing images on their screens than their CRT ancestors. Recall our somewhat technical discussion from earlier, where we went into how the unique characteristics of CRT display technology effectively made it so that light guns could, in fact, work and relay appropriate calculated positional data to connected consoles or computers. Well, with the advent of LCD displays, all of the timing-based algorithms that were required for light guns to function properly fell entirely by the wayside. And further, LCD technology includes inherent lag in the time required to update any imagery on their screens. Even the most minute lag that might be undetectable by a human is just enough to make traditional light guns fail to register hits in the same way that CRT displays allowed. And because of this technological shift, the concept of true light gun peripherals as we've described them no longer exists. The story doesn't end there though, as there have been several newer technologies that have attempted to bridge the gap between traditional light guns and modern displays. One of which, pioneered by consoles like the Nintendo Wii, utilizes infrared sensors to help gamers have light gun experiences on modern displays, though from my perspective, infrared light guns and other controllers are not nearly as accurate as the light guns of old, and using them effectively feels like trying to drag a less than responsive mouse cursor across your television screen, using a device that is much less usable than a traditional mouse, in an attempt to actually aim and shoot at whatever target you were trying to dispatch. I really wanted to like infrared shooting games, but the fact is, for me, they just never really hit the mark. More exciting, however, is a series of newer peripherals that are meant to work with modern displays without any appreciable lag whatsoever. Such products like the Sinden light gun utilize a built-in camera rather than a light-detecting diode to identify the boundaries of an artificial border that's drawn around your game content using a provided software package, and then uses fancy mathematical calculations to determine where on the screen you're aiming and what the end result of pulling the trigger will be. While I haven't personally tried out any of the new wave of pseudo light guns, I am optimistic based on reviews I've read and demonstrations I've watched, and I know I will absolutely be buying one of these cool, albeit mostly unnecessary, devices in the future. The history of light guns in gaming is still being written, despite having been in existence in some form or fashion for over 100 years. And within that history, a few special experiences truly stand out as landmark releases in the genre. One of those, of course, is Operation Wolf, the first time that light guns were used to recreate a realistic, visceral feeling of warfare. And while the light gun genre may not be as widely popular as it used to be, that in no way trivializes its spot in gaming history, and it in no way diminishes the significance of Operation Wolf as a premier arcade title that, at least for the time it was released, provided gamers with an experience unlike anything they had seen before. If that's not worth being remembered for, I don't know what is. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Operation Wolf today versus when it was released 37 years ago. So Operation Wolf, in its base form, is a very traditional light gun based arcade shooter, consisting of 6 stages during which you'll experience what is effectively an on-rails kind of experience, where the screen continuously shifts horizontally as enemies, hostages, and innocent civilians fill the screen. Your goal, as you might expect, is to shoot the bad guys while not shooting the good guys, which in some cases is easier said than done. Unlike many shooters released prior to Operation Wolf, this game is focused on presenting a view of the battlefield as opposed to simply a shooting gallery kind of interface, and in doing that, the game immediately feels higher stakes than what it would otherwise seem, and those high stakes definitely helped increase my engagement with the title. As you play through these tense stages, you have a few high-level goals that you need to complete in order to beat a given level. When you begin a stage, you're presented with enemy counts assigned to different enemy types, those being on-foot soldiers, air vehicles, and ground vehicles, and you have to defeat whatever number of each enemy type the game tells you to in order to move on to the next stage. As a purely hypothetical example, you might enter a stage and be told that you have to kill 50 on-foot soldiers, 10 helicopters, and 5 tanks, all displayed on the screen via a condensed icon-based table with enemy counts, and that level will continue to play until you eventually defeat all of those listed enemies, or until you die and fail your mission. As is typical with many games, missions start out relatively easy and over the course of playing the game, become decidedly more difficult, as you'll be waylaid by numerous enemies who want nothing more than to shoot you full of lead. Luckily, the game does provide a brief indicator telling you which enemies are attempting to attack you. Before an enemy shoots you, he'll flash white, which is your cue to focus your attention on that bad guy. Otherwise, you'll likely take some damage. And speaking of damage, the game is designed so that you do have a life bar that needs to be depleted before you fail your mission, which is a nice touch. That said, you only have a single life in any given playthrough, and depending on which version of the game you're playing, you may not have continues available to restart from a given level after failing, which can make the experience dramatically more difficult. If we're talking arcade versions of the title, whether or not you have continues available is really up to the arcade operator, as there are a series of dip switches that can be set to alter the difficulty of the title, one of which affects whether continues are allowed or not. And actually, we should probably talk briefly about the concept of arcade dip switches, because I don't think we've really talked about them before. When arcade games were created and shipped, many of them had configurable settings that arcade operators could alter, effectively tailoring the arcade experience based on what they wanted for their particular arcade. Some games were designed with debug menus or other digital ways of changing settings, such as the number of lives you start with, or how many coins it takes to purchase a credit, or occasionally even the overall difficulty of the title. Other games, though, were designed with physical switches, known as dip switches, that arcade operators could set that would alter the functionality of a title. And for Operation Wolf, one of those dip switches settings was whether continues were enabled. If they were enabled, then after any given player death, the player would be presented with a timer during which they could insert an additional coin and purchase another credit, which would enable them to continue from the beginning of the stage that they last died in. If continues were disabled, though, then you literally only had one life to play through the entire game, and because hit points and ammunition are carried over from mission to mission, this was a remarkably more difficult way to play the title. The good thing is that each level provides ample opportunity to replenish your ammunition via drops from various enemies, as well as items hidden in different objects, or in some cases, randomly appearing on the screen as you scroll through an individual level. Operation Wolf gives you two types of ammo. Your base weapon is a machine gun, and you typically start the game with multiple ammo clips for that weapon, and assuming you don't spray machine gun fire everywhere without hitting your targets, it's really not too difficult to maintain a suitable stash of machine gun bullets. Your secondary weapon is a rocket bomb kind of weapon, which has a dramatically more limited supply, as you can only carry a handful of rockets at any point in time. Those rockets are very powerful though, and can effectively destroy any enemy in the game, short of the final boss fight, in one shot. And because the rocket has a certain amount of splash damage, you can occasionally take out multiple enemies with a single rocket blast, assuming you aim and time your shot well enough. As you play the game, you can also find a few other power-ups, such as items that partially replenish your hit points, some sticks of dynamite that, as you might expect, explode in a large area of effect if you shoot them, and a free machine gun fire power-up that gives you unlimited and continuous machine gun fire for several seconds, which in some levels is a godsend because there are some stages where the enemy assault is simply relentless. And actually, at this point, it might make sense to go through the individual levels in the game, though because each stage basically comes down to shoot enemies before they shoot you, there's really not a ton to talk about within each stage itself. What I really want to highlight though are some difficulty spikes that exist within the game, because some stages are the equivalent of a walk in the park, while others make it feel like you're running a 100-meter dash in hell over coals while being pitchforked at the same time. Putting that visual aside, the game consists of 6 different levels, along with an occasional mini shooting stage that can pop up in between levels, seemingly at random. Looking more closely at the core non-random levels, the first stage involves disabling enemy communications in a nearby base, which is the second easiest level in the game, as you might expect given its placement as the first level of the game. The second stage is a jungle-themed level, and here is where you'll face the first difficulty spike in the game, as this level throws a fair number of enemies at you concurrently, and it can be challenging to take them all out before they begin shooting you, dropping your hit points rapidly, especially if multiple bad guys are taking shots at you at the same time. Assuming you get through the main section of this level and defeat all required enemies, the stage ends with a hostage standoff, where a big bad enemy uses a civilian as a human shield that ostensibly you should avoid shooting, instead taking targeted shots at the bad guy. In reality, if you have enough hit points, you can simply shoot the enemy and the hostage, as the only real punishment that I noticed was taking some damage for your careless shooting. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not condoning shooting the hostage. I'm simply saying that you don't really get penalized all that much if you're less careful with your shots. The third stage takes place in a village and is the easiest level in the entire game, having a low number of enemies and vehicles to defeat, which you need to do without shooting any civilians lest you lose some hit points. If you end up making it through this level, which if you've gotten this far, you likely will, you'll get rewarded with a full hit point replenishment, which is good because you'll now be entering the harder stages of the game. The fourth stage is roughly the same difficulty as the second stage, and if you beat that level, you'll have your ammo fully replenished, which is definitely beneficial as you head into stage 5, which takes place in a concentration camp. The big focus of this stage is to save 5 hostages, which in the context of this game means not shooting them, not inadvertently blasting them with area effect damage from a rocket, and killing any enemies who are attempting to kill the hostages. Assuming you can keep a hostage alive for 10 to 15 seconds, they'll simply say thank you and disappear from the screen, which credits you with a hostage save. If you don't save the hostage though, you take some damage and the game simply plays on. Now interestingly, I played through this level multiple times, and I didn't notice any adverse effect to losing every single hostage versus saving every hostage. I'm assuming this might impact your overall score, but because I wasn't paying much attention to my score total other than to make sure it kept going up, it felt like the hostage mechanic was kinda half-baked at best, at least in this stage. Stage 5 is also the first stage where you'll face what feels like insurmountable forces, and depending on your control scheme of choice when tackling the level, you may either be nicely challenged, or you may end up feeling like you're bashing your head into a wall. And here, it probably makes sense to talk about some of the control schemes prevalent in the title, and why they do and don't work. If you're playing Operation Wolf on an actual arcade machine, then you'll likely be using the Uzi-based light gun that's attached to the cabinet, in which case you are having the most authentic experience possible, and are enjoying the tightest controls and most engaging combat out of any version of the title. If, however, you're like me and are playing the arcade version at home via MAME emulation, you likely are facing one of two different control options, either controller-based input or mouse-driven input. When I first started playing the game, I was using a control pad to move a visible cursor around the screen, shooting enemies whenever possible, and attempting to actually hit bad guys before they hit me. In the early stages, this control scheme was passable, but by the time you get to the 5th stage, control pad-based movement becomes a detriment to both your ability to play the game, as well as your ability to actually enjoy the game. I hit a brick wall with my first playthrough that required numerous attempts to get past stage 5, none of which felt particularly good as I continued to fail time and time again. Eventually, I did get past the stage, which brought me to the final stage in the game, stage 6. Now, let me tell you about stage 6 when using a control pad for input. It is nearly impossible, short of getting some ridiculously good luck from both an enemy spawn standpoint as well as from a power-up availability perspective. Stage 6 throws a ridiculous number of high-damaging enemies at you at the same time, and often at opposite sides of the screen, which makes moving your targeting cursor incredibly challenging to both accurately aim as well as quickly navigate across wide expanses of a given stage. I played this level for a couple hours exclusively, and the best I was able to get to was 7 soldiers remaining and 10 helicopters left to down. I never beat the stage using a control pad. It truly felt nearly impossible. After stepping away for half a day or so to clear my mind, I tackled the game again, this time at my computer using a mouse for input. And holy cow, what a totally different experience. Using the mouse for input enabled much more accurate targeting and turned the entire game from an arbitrarily challenging experience into an incredibly engaging, albeit still challenging, experience. And I am proud to say that I did in fact beat stage 6, and by extension the game, sort of, using the mouse as opposed to a control pad. If you decide to play the game, I highly encourage you to use a mouse for aiming and shooting. It is almost a requirement if you want to stand any chance at beating the game. Anyway, assuming you beat stage 6, regardless of your control scheme, you'll be presented with one of several different endings, depending on how successful you were in saving a series of hostages in the final stage. Surprisingly, saving hostages in stage 6 wasn't really all that challenging, and even beating the final boss of the level, which is a huge helicopter that fires missiles at you, isn't really all that difficult. Getting up to that final fight though, and actually completing the stage, that's where the difficulty is in this one, and it is by far the hardest level in the entire game. After you watch the ending that you earned by playing the game, you'll have your hit points and ammo replenished, and then be sent off to complete another playthrough of the game, affectionately known in the Operation Wolf community as Loop 2. This loop is dramatically more challenging than the first loop through the game, as enemies come at you faster and fire quicker than what you experienced at any point thus far. Some levels are so ridiculous in their enemy assault that many videos depicting playthroughs of Loop 2 have actually posted a photosensitive seizure warning before the video, simply because of how frequently and rapidly the screen flashes as you tackle that second playthrough. Interestingly, while Loop 2 is in fact more difficult than your first loop through the game, it's also in some ways easier, as the sheer number of enemies filling the screen can make it easier to hit and kill bad guys, even if your aim is somewhat subpar. The stages in Loop 2 end much quicker than those in Loop 1, either because you've been killed quicker than before, or because you've dispatched more enemies in a shorter period of time than your previous playthrough. Other than the increased difficulty, the second loop is marked by some time of day shifts in the stages, most notably in the first stage where, instead of taking place in early afternoon daylight, has now shifted to late afternoon sunset. This, I will admit, is a nice change that I thought added some diversity to the second playthrough, though honestly, it's not all that different than the first playthrough, other than the difficulty like we already talked about. Assuming you beat Loop 2, you are then thrust into Loop 3, which begins the game yet again. I played through the first 4 or so stages of Loop 3, and I didn't really notice any difficulty difference from an overall perspective, so this is where I ended up turning off the game, content that I had experienced everything Operation Wolf had to offer. According to certain individuals in the Operation Wolf community, every single loop ups the difficulty level, while checking out the instructions for the NES port of the title suggests that the game effectively ends after loop 4. Though in true arcade fashion, you're still sent off to complete subsequent loops indefinitely if you end up beating the 4th loop. I don't know what reality is in this instance, but what I can say is that if you've beaten the game through 2 loops, you've seen it all. There's no real need from my perspective to keep playing it ad nauseum, and I'd even argue that completing a single loop is sufficient to see most of what the game has to offer, other than the increased difficulty and daylight shift during the second playthrough. I'll provide my opinion of whether multiple playthroughs is worth it in just a couple minutes when we dive deeper into the more specific aspects of the game. But before we can do that, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these titles. I love learning how different companies marketed their products to try to get consumers to buy them. For Operation Wolf, it's a little bit different because it originated as an arcade title, so you obviously don't have a box to look at that specific version, but we will be looking at the NES version of Operation Wolf just to provide a complete and thorough look at Operation Wolf from a consumer buying experience. So, for Operation Wolf, for the NES, the back of the box says... Operation Wolf. Get briefed on the 6 mission levels you must fight through, rout out heavily armed terrorists lurking in the jungle, and make it to the airport and get the prisoners out alive. And that's it. There are 3 screenshots on the back of the box. There are 3 captions to those screenshots, and that is literally all you get on the back of the box for Operation Wolf for the NES. And I've got to say, this one does not sell me at all. There is not nearly enough content on the back of the box to really sell me on what this game is. Sure, it's a light gun shooter kind of experience, but there's nothing here. This is very lazy advertising, very lazy packaging from my perspective. The front of the box actually looks kind of cool. It's way better than the back of the box. The back of the box gives me no information whatsoever. I would not have picked this up back in the day, and honestly, I did not pick this up back in the day. But the fact is that I did not play the NES version for this episode of the podcast. I played the arcade original. So every part of our discussion that we've had and every part of the discussion that's to come is focused on the arcade game, not the NES game. So just keep that in mind as I relay my personal opinions. We're going to talk about those opinions right now. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The visuals in Operation Wolf are pretty darn awesome, with high-quality arcade graphics that represent some of the best seemingly hand-drawn pixel art that you will see in an arcade title from around this time. Enemy and character sprites are all incredibly detailed, with a variety of enemy sizes on display depending on how deep in the screen a given enemy is located. See a bad guy in the distance? Well, he'll be super tiny. See an enemy pop up right in front of your face? He'll be gigantic, and the level of detail here is impressive. Now, nobody would ever mistake these graphics to be photorealistic or digital representations of people, but for pixel art style visuals, I actually thought Operation Wolf looked really good. Animations are similarly high quality, though here I feel like the game wasn't quite as well designed as how the static graphics were. While I don't feel like any animations had issues, they just felt a bit less detailed than the sprite work for the characters overall. It's not a huge deal, but it is something I noticed. Environments, meanwhile, all look great, though if I were to levy a critique, it would be that a couple levels in the game don't look all that different from one another, which makes those levels feel and look similar. Many of the stages that showed alternate graphics, which was welcome diversity, and even the 2 stages that looked pretty similar with one another were designed to have some visual distinctions, which I thought was a nice touch. And as crazy as it sounds, I really liked the daytime shift that accompanied the second loop through the game in comparison to the first loop. I know this was simply a recoloring to several scenes, but regardless, I appreciated the change. Enemy vehicles, similar to the character sprite work, all looked really good, though outside of a few different vehicle types, there wasn't a ton of diversity here. The vehicle designs that were included in the game, which included speedboats with mounted guns, tanks, helicopters, and jeeps, were all designed well. I just kinda wish there were more vehicles included. I should also mention that there are some very brief cutscenes included between each level, which in this context consisted of a single static image with some text displayed underneath the image. These images looked pretty darn good, and kept the same level of quality as the character designs I discussed earlier. In fact, they kinda felt like stills from the old G.I. Joe cartoon from the 1980s. I suppose this might have been what the designers were going for, but I have no proof of that. Regardless, overall, I thought Operation Wolf looked great visually, with only a bit of sameness across various design elements of the game serving to detract from the overall visual environment in the title. Moving on to the sound and music, from a musical perspective, there's not really a ton here, other than the music that plays during the attract mode and intro for the game, and some very brief musical interludes that play in between stages. The music that was included sounded good and appropriately conveyed the war-centric settings of the rest of the title. I just kinda wish there was more of it. Sound effects, meanwhile, are the main auditory star of the title, and here I thought the game's designers did an outstanding job, with a variety of sounds for different bullet fire, enemy vehicles, environmental effects, and death screams as you defeat various bad guys from one stage to the next. The only annoyance, and my suspicion is it was designed this way, was the beeping that accompanied whenever your HP was nearly depleted. This beeping starts relatively early from a damage perspective, and becomes quicker paced the closer to death you become. Because of how challenging some of the levels were, and the fact that health power-ups were fairly scarce, you'll likely be hearing this beeping a lot as you become more proficient with playing the game. When you first start playing, this will likely be a welcome warning, as it gives you an indicator that something is wrong, and you need to begin playing more cautiously, or perhaps with additional focus to shoot enemies before they shoot you. As you keep playing more though, the noise becomes a bit of an irritant, to the point where I started thinking to myself, okay, I get it, I'm about to die, you don't need to continuously beep at me. I understand why the beeping was included, and I appreciate the audio as well as visual cues that let you know that you're about to die, but I would be lying if I said that particular sound the designers chose wasn't just a wee bit irritating to listen to on what will eventually amount to a loop. Coupling that noise without any in-level music, and you have a situation where the audio can get a little obnoxious. I should also mention that there are some very brief digitized voice lines included in the game, some of which sound like the designers told a robot to say a collection of words without appreciable care to common cadences in English speech. I recognize as a late 80s arcade title, we shouldn't expect super high quality voice acting, but I was still shocked at the line that accompanies a mission failure, which literally is read as, "You have sustained a lethal injury. Sorry, but you are finished. Here." That pause before the word here felt so odd to me when I first heard it. Ultimately, this is a minor nitpick, but it is absolutely noticeable, and I'd venture a guess this is likely a line that arcade goers from the late 80s will probably recall, because it feels like something that would be a somewhat iconic part of the game. Having never played Operation Wolf in earnest before this episode, I hold no nostalgia for the oddly spoken line, which is likely why it just felt a bit odd to me. Otherwise though, the audio environment in the game was great, and while I do wish there was more music on display, the sound effects did appropriately ratchet up the action, and in some cases tension in each level that you play through, and I definitely enjoyed that aspect of the experience. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Special Forces operative Roy Adams, and you are tasked with saving a number of hostages from enemy clutches, which over the course of the game requires you to disrupt enemy communications, discover the whereabouts of concentration camps, break civilians out of prison, and ultimately assist in an airborne escape from behind enemy lines. Assuming you're successful, you'll rescue the hostages, receive a commendation from the president, and return home. If you're not successful though, you may never be trusted to go on another mission, not to mention the loss of life that would come with a failed hostage rescue attempt. I've got to say, I thought the simplicity of the story in this instance really worked with the title, because the entire game is undeniably more focused on gameplay over story, which for a light gun shooter makes perfect sense. I also appreciated how the story, despite being simple, was told via cutscenes during the act of playing the game, rather than needing to look the narrative up online, as we would do today, or needing to read an instruction manual or strategy guide as we would do back in 1987. There is just the right amount of story here to enhance the title without turning it into something it isn't, and I thought this was definitely the right approach for the game. Moving on to the playability and controls, the controls here are about as simple as they come, though like we talked about, the effectiveness of the controls are highly dependent on which control scheme you end up using for your version of the title. In the arcades, the game would be controlled using a light gun replica of an Uzi, complete with motorized recoil. All you have to do when using that control scheme is aim by literally moving the Uzi around to aim at different parts of the screen, pull your trigger to shoot, and press a button near the muzzle of the gun to fire off a grenade blast. Undoubtedly, this is the most natural control mechanism for the game, and if you have a chance to play Operation Wolf at a local retro-themed arcade, I definitely recommend you try out this control scheme. Slightly less natural, though still pretty darn amazing, is mouse-based control, where you move a visual targeting reticle on the screen by moving your mouse, and can click the left and right mouse buttons to fire an automatic weapon and throw a grenade blast respectively. This is the most natural feeling way to play the game outside of standing in front of an actual arcade cabinet, and playing the game using the mouse feels pretty darn awesome. Decidedly less natural, though still something that'll work in a pinch, is using a controller to play the game, with the directional pad used to move a visual targeting reticle on the screen, and your A and B buttons assigned to firing your weapon and tossing grenades, similar to how other control schemes work. This mode of control works fine for early levels in the game, but fails miserably as you approach the final two stages, with the last stage in particular being, from my perspective, effectively unbeatable using a control pad to move around the screen and target enemies. I'm sure it can be beaten using a control pad, but I don't know why you would want to put yourself through that misery. Later light gun titles like Mad Dog McCree included a speed modifier for moving your targeting reticle around the screen, where if you held a specific button, your cursor would move faster, making it so that you could cover pretty long screen distances quickly, which is really the only reason why certain light gun games could be completed using a controller in the first place. This kind of control scheme was not available for Operation Wolf, which made the game dramatically more difficult than it should have been for controller users. Outside of the controls, which were all responsive despite some of the issues prevalent in certain control schemes, the overall playability of the title, for the most part, is as good today as it ever has been. We talked about a good portion of the game's structure already, so I'm not going to reiterate all of that here. What I will say though is that Operation Wolf plays really well, and would feel right at home in a modern retro-themed shooter collection. The gameplay hasn't really aged at all, which is definitely a good thing. So overall, how did it feel to play Operation Wolf? Well, once I started playing Operation Wolf using a mouse, I had a really fun and engaging time, so much so that even playing through the game multiple times felt great, despite the fact that each playthrough wasn't really appreciably different from the last, other than an increased level of difficulty. Playing Operation Wolf using a control pad, however, was another thing entirely, and while you can technically play it that way, you're not going to enjoy yourself beyond the first 4 stages. If you have a desire to play this particular brand of light gun shooter, definitely take the time to use a mouse. Otherwise, you're not going to be experiencing Operation Wolf in a way that best showcases the things it does well. So what is our overall verdict on Operation Wolf? Operation Wolf represents a style of gameplay that has become incredibly rare nowadays, mostly driven by the fact that the light gun technology of the past simply doesn't work with many of our modern LCD-based devices. But through the magic of emulation, we can experience games like Operation Wolf using alternative control schemes, and considering how well designed the game is, I believe there's a lot to like for anyone who wants to give the game a shot. That said, I don't know that the game really has a ton of staying power, as one loop through the game is only 6 stages that, assuming you're skilled enough to beat them without using a ton of continues, represents a pretty short experience. Even subsequent loops through the game are quick, despite the additional difficulty, and once you've played through the game once, you've seen everything there is to see. That doesn't discount the goodness that is here, but unless you're keen on pursuing a spot on the high score leaderboard, there's really not a ton of replayability here. Because of that, and because of the lack of quality controls that accompany the home versions of the title in their default configurations, Operation Wolf is, from my perspective, a solid addition to our list of golden oldies. It definitely does a lot right, and while I didn't personally experience Operation Wolf in the arcades back in the late 80s, I can imagine that those who did likely felt like they were seeing and experiencing the future of arcade entertainment. It is not a perfect game, and it likely isn't something you'll go back to again and again. But from my standpoint, everyone owes it to themselves to spend at least a little bit of time playing the title, and I therefore have no reservations adding Operation Wolf to our list of golden oldies. That was our episode on Operation Wolf. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Virtua Racing, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you to make sure that I am delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to focus on delivering the best possible podcast I can, and I want to continue to grow our community to make this truly something special. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Virtua Racing. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.